One, it's time to build some worlds and make stuff. So we're going to dig into some various aspects of world building, as we often do here on World Building Wednesday. And today's topic will be clothing, the uses thereof and the relative need thereof. So let's scroll down. So today we're going to talk about clothing. And I think there are several major elements of clothing. So, clothing has three sort of roles in society. Clothing as protection, clothing as clothing versus nudity taboo, and clothing as status. And we'll go through these one by one. We'll actually cover the nudity taboo first. Most human societies have some kind of taboo around nudity. You just are not, you do not show your entire body at all times. And so that is a useful sort of thing to recognize and work into your world in terms of recognizing that there are going to be some parts of the body that people just feel should not be, are private, basically. And some people get kind of worked up by this being a whole shame-based thing, and that's kind of part of it, but it's also, it seems to be deeper than that. It's not just that people have to feel shame about their bodies, it's that there are some things that are seen as sacred, for lack of a better word, or private. So it's important to think about what parts of a person's body are considered private that you will not show off. And it's not just nudity. In other words, it's not just the entire human body. So, for example, there may be degrees of nudity where, so in our society, for example, you certainly can show off pretty much every part of the body. But, for example, back in, say, the mid 20th century, a woman would not show off her navel, right? So her midriff. That was a bit much for a lady. You could walk around in shorts and a t-shirt potentially, or jeans and a t-shirt. But a bare midriff was definitely a bit beyond the pale for most people. And the bikini came along and stuff like that. So it's that kind of thing to think about, that there are sort of degrees of clothing and what you do or don't show, and in what context, right? So to give you an example of how interesting these things can be, in the early Christian church during Roman times, baptisms were performed with the person receiving the baptism had to be completely naked, to represent this as a new birth, that they were coming into a new life. So they had to be, no jewelry, no nothing. And it was a very important, symbol of the whole thing. And of course, nudity was different back then as well in terms of context. So again, something to think about, and also in terms of what is appropriate to see in different contexts, right? So at home, you may be more casual about things than in a private location, and similarly out in public. So let's put that in the document as well. Degrees of nudity, different parts of the body, more or less private, and then physical / social context. Casual nudity at home versus outside, right? So all things to think about. Then there's clothing as protection, right? As protection from the elements. So there are a lot of societies where, even though clothes aren't necessary in terms of there being, shame or taboos around it, still you want something to protect you from the cold or from animals, wild animals. And so it's useful to think about what kind of things a society or people in a society will be encountering. What kind of clothing that will suggest. So if you're in a hot and humid area, you're going to generally have relatively light, relatively loose clothing. So you may cover your entire body, but you're generally not going to, you're going to wear something more like a light cloak, where you can have a breeze blowing up and it's more light. It's not going to be a very constricting, outfit compared to other climates where you want something that is close to your body and is keeping that cold out. So again, comparing, an Aztec society with a Siberian society, very different. And then again, what kind of things those are protecting against. So, the cold is pervasive, so you need to kind of cover every bit of your body. Whereas if you're living in, say, a very mountainous environment, you might focus a lot on boots and gloves and have protection there, but you don't need stuff around the cold per se. Although mountains tend to be chillier, but you get the drift. So clothing is protection, and then clothing is status. So even in a society where there is no nudity taboo, whatever, often clothing becomes a thing because it's a way of differentiating people. Actually, we'll throw that in as well. Clothing as identifier and differentiator, which is related to status, right? So, in our society, a suit means something different than a t-shirt, and implies different things about your level of success, if you will, in society. But then also even further, again, imagine a society with no nudity taboo whatsoever. You can wear as much or as little as you want. The nicer the things that you put on your body, the more, the wealthier you appear to other people. So you're going to see people who absolutely wear certain kinds of clothing to communicate things with that, and also to make themselves look different than other people, right? If everyone is, if no one's wearing clothing, then it's hard to differentiate yourself. Whereas putting at least like a pin in your hair or, wearing certain kinds of clothing will differentiate you. So you tend to see that over time. Often clothing becomes more about status than about protection or even about covering private parts of the body. It's just this is how you show that you're a unique person and different from other people. So those are all different ways that clothing are important in society, and it's important to not get too caught up in any one thing and to pay attention to all of these as you're kind of building your society. And one of the nice things is you don't have to worry about this right off the bat, right? Things like geography and religion and things tend to be a little more fundamental than things like clothing. But clothing is a great way of differentiating your world, right? If people dress differently in your world for very specific reasons, then that will tend to make your world feel, more well-rounded and more different. So let's look at the settings that we've been building. We have our Bronze Age world where food is plentiful. So people are grabbing food from the environment, minimal magic, migrant society, people going in caravans from spot to spot, and this sort of mono-religion, more or less. Fatalistic society, parents tend to have large families with children getting jobs fairly early. Communal clothing. So here we go. Children wear a lot of communal clothing they grow out of, pass on to younger children. Leave these in personal possession. The clothes that a child actually owns are rare and special. Interesting. A major event in many children's lives is their first piece of personal clothing. So that implies certainly there's some clothing involved there. So we already have our taboo that you don't bring up the gods in casual conversation. Taboos will just kind of evolve over time. So let's talk a bit about clothing. So we have a verdant society. A verdant world. Which implies it's temperate, or at least warm. Lots, if plants are surviving, then it's not going to be really chilly, nor is it going to be, massively hot. So it implies you certainly don't need heavy clothing. Certainly you'll have seasons, but your society But you will have, in a very verdant world where and we talk about how way out in the wilderness you have plants that are trying to kill you and a lot of feral animals. That means that you will need some protective clothing against vines and brambles and things like that. So we're going to have that kind of thing. And since we have people moving around a lot, I think clothing will also be an important indicator of status in that sense, in terms of differentiating, me in my caravan from you in your caravan. So there's probably going to be less status in the sense of I am more powerful than you, but more in the sense of a differentiator. So let's start typing that stuff up. People wear, I want to say, moderate amounts of clothing, both to protect themselves from wild plants and animals, and to differentiate families and caravans. We'll say caravans. Caravans from each other. Let's even say caravans often develop communal, honestly, standards of clothing. Everyone wears a head wrap or a particular kind of belt, etc. So almost this caravan uniform, although it's not the entire outfit, but the people kind of tend to standardize on something that identifies them as part of this caravan. It might even be amulets on some, or hats. So something to differentiate, and it'll vary from one to one. So it might be hats here, it might be belts there. It might be a certain color of clothing where people tend to wear cloaks of a certain color. So that kind of makes sense. I've also been thinking about this a little bit in terms of this society. Hey, Cephalopod. Would clothing include body modifications such as tattoos, piercing, head shaping, etc.? Yes, definitely. And clothing gets into, in fact, let's add that as a note. Clothing can also include tattoos, piercing, head shaping, and other forms of bodily modification. Okay. And that would actually tie into this, where some caravans it might be everybody has a single long earring, that dangles from one ear. And that just kind of identifies them as that part of that caravan. It's just what everyone does. So I think the society probably will not have a lot of body modification, in the sense of, again, piercing or elongated necks or elongated things. If you're living in an agricultural society, you might, because, you're training crops, and so there is this idea of shaping something over time and evolving it and doing that to people kind of makes sense. Maybe the priests do that. Like that idea. Oops, wrong place. So let's say the many gods, everyone priesthood. Priests often, we'll say nearly always, perform some kind of body modification to represent, not just to represent, to model or to simulate how the gods shape nature and the world. This ranges from piercings to elongation of body parts to, even in extreme cases, what would you call chopping off a piece of your body? Amputations. So there'll be some extreme sects where, in order to truly, worship a god, you have to chop off a finger, or something along those lines. Good idea, Saf. Thank you. So I think we're not going to have too much in the way of body modification amongst regular people. Again, partly because you have this very migrant society. You need people to be pretty hale and hearty, and to be able to deal with variations from place to place. The other thing about nudity, I think in this context, there's going to be some casual nudity, like within a caravan home, if you will. So within one of those, caravan wagons, an individual family, somebody can change in and out of an outfit, for example, in front of other people, and nobody really minds. And a toddler could walk around wearing just a shirt, and no one's really going to mind, as long as it's within the wagon. And I think also probably like bathing would be done in the nude. It just kind of doesn't make sense to have bathing suits in this context. But I think those are going to be sort of very defined situations, and that would still be seen as inappropriate, in a regular situation, even from wagon to wagon. You're not going to just kind of walk naked from one place to another, or significantly unclothed. Let's say that people bathe naked, usually in groups, in streams and lakes, and brief casual nudity within a family wagon is normal, but otherwise people generally cover their privates. People keep their privates. We'll say groins covered. Toplessness among women, I think, is going to be might be more common in their world, where that's just not a big deal. But still might be, because part of the thing, one of the reasons why toplessness is relatively rare in our societies is that the breasts are seen as a sign of nurturing and sort of a holy thing, so they're generally covered in a lot of societies. So we'll say women typically keep their breasts covered in public, but public nursing and sunbathe and topless, we'll say topless like sunbathing is common, right? So, and by that I mean, if a woman is just sort of casually hanging out, and similarly, walking from wagon to wagon, and she doesn't have a top on, that's not really a big deal. It would be seen as unusual, but not remarkable. And I would say especially amongst girls, in fact, let's say that. Young girls often go topless, but women generally keep their breasts covered in public, although nursing and is common, and an adult woman walking from one wagon to another while topless would not excite comment. That makes sense. So a young girl running around in just a skirt or something would be something where no one's really going to mind. You would expect the girl as she grows up to wear something more appropriate, but it's just not big of a deal. So let's get into specifics. I think in this society we're going to have again pretty flowing clothing. So we're going to have a lot of dresses, kilts, tunics, things along those lines. Clothing is usually loose and flowing, but covers most of the body. Tunics, skirts, kilts, dresses. I think there's a kirt, K-I-R-T, something along those lines, which would be it is essentially like a skirt for men, if you will, like a kilt. So we have those and dresses, etc. Pants are usually reserved for hunters and others who live in the wilderness. And then again, you got kind of shirts and normal stuff like that. I'm gonna say also, would hats be common? Head coverings. There's no reason not to, because you are going to be out in an environment where you've got things dropping down on you, and you want to keep the sun out of your eyes potentially. But it's a very verdant world, so there's not going to be you're generally going to be in wooded environments or jungle environments. So, I'm trying to think. I don't think I want to go in any detail about head coverings in this world. There doesn't need to be anything calling out for a particular head covering one way or the other. Some folks have hats, some folks don't. Helmets, etc. Feet. Do people go barefoot, or do they wear like shoes, or do they wear like boots or like sandals? Sandals are cheap and easy. There's a sense of kind of touching the ground. I think what we'll say. I like the idea that like people like to have to feel the ground with their feet without anything in between them, but that's not practical. So we'll say that people generally go barefoot within the caravan and while the caravan is stopped. During travel, people wear sandals or basically boots. Hunters and rangers invariably wear boots. So there's that kind of differentiator where once you stop for the night, once you get back in the wagon, whatever, you kick your shoes off, kick your sandals off, and you kind of relax. But when you start out, you put on your shoes and you go. So that's a nice differentiator. And again, sandals, like you say, are, or like you suggested, are an inexpensive and easy covering that at least gets things off. But in a world like this where there's a lot of nasty plant life, a lot of nasty animal life, you're going to want some significant covering for your feet. So you're probably going to see some people kind of roughing it with sandals, if you will, with a lot of others going with some serious boots and shoes and such. All right, so I like that. Let's also think about status. So the head, what do we talk about in terms of the organization if we have? If you're a migrant. Caravans led by a sole leader who institutes a council. The council is elected. Some just use a council, some are run by a leader. Okay. The head of a caravan and or the council members will all have some we'll go with head covering. Typically wear a particular hat or head covering, while everyone else either goes bareheaded, not bareheaded, that would be very weird. There's a bear on your head, or wears very different, simple head coverings. These can vary from ornate, feathered hats to a simple cloth wrapped around the head. Okay. So there's where, so I'm trying to think about, head, body, feet, all different parts of a body. And again, I don't think, because councils are elected and leaders are elected, that we wouldn't have body modification on those. You could certainly have, when you're a leader, you get a pierced nose or something, but probably not. I think not in this world. Although that might happen in some caravans, right? But I don't think it would be common. So, okay, I think that gives us a good idea of the clothing in setting 1. Let's move on to setting 2. The communist ranches, that's right. Relatively high technology, gunpowder exists. Everyone lives in these ranches with communal property, with families living very close. And children living in their parents' room, once they get once they become 12 or so, they move to another room. We have the really weird magic, which I want to get back to at some point. Large dude ranches for your settlements. Okay, with trade guilds, it's sort of this cross element of society. So all the people in a ranch might all be members of different guilds. Probably will be. Religion is kind of diverse. People have smaller families. Clerics generally have a lot of children. Children generally have a lot of jobs on the ranch. There's a fishing walkabout upon adolescence, 12 to 18. And then double blinking conversations can just assign a duplicity, which I really like. So let's talk about clothing. And obviously, clothing could go into taboos, nudity, and such. But for now, so in this society, I think, yeah, exactly, Seth. We're gonna have leather all over the place. So the ubiquity of leather means a lot of leather used in clothing. Now, leather is actually not a very comfortable thing to wear in a garment that needs to move. So a leather shirt is actually very uncomfortable because it tends to bind in the corners. So it's great for boots, for example. It's great for belts and other things like that. But the human body is this very needs a lot of flexibility in terms of its shape. So you don't see as much leather that way, unless you do very specific things with it. So for example, a leather apron works because it's basically a sheet hanging down and then leather straps here and around the waist. So that totally works. If you could imagine, for example, a standard piece of clothing might be like an apron like that, and then like a kilt or like a loincloth kind of a thing. That would kind of work because you have again belt, pieces of cloth hanging down, and then the apron. But that still leaves significant parts of your body exposed. So you're probably not going to see it that much. So leather generally makes sense as a thing along with, fabric clothing of some kind. So they kind of marry in that way. Everyone owns leather boots, belts. What else? Probably bracers, belts, and bracers. More wealthy individuals also own heavily worked leather pants. I was gonna say probably jackets as well. Jackets and bracers. Pants and shirts. These require a lot of manual labor to become flexible enough for become sufficiently flexible. So we can imagine a foreman or the head of a trade guild wears an entirely leather outfit, and that indicates that they know people they can pay for the insane amount of manipulation of that leather to make it supple and make it comfortable for your entire outfit. But everyone's got leather. Everyone's wearing leather. Otherwise, people tend to wear quite a lot of clothing to protect themselves when, we'll just say, animals can be dangerous, right? So if you're going and dealing with whatever the equivalent of cattle and horses and pigs and sheep, you really don't want, you really want layers between you and their hooves and their bodies. So, and also let's be honest, the mud and the stuff like that. So people are going to be pretty heavily clothed, I think. And I think that will work its way also into regular society, or into sort of private society, where I think people just aren't going to just strip down and hang out naked together. Just everyone's clothed all the time, more or less. Which might indicate that nudity becomes a very special thing, sort of a holy time, where you might have religious practices that are performed with partial or full nudity, because it's seen as a sign of something special, something unusual, something remarkable. So let's say that. This also follows into the private sphere. People even lounging around at home will still wear at least their under layer of clothes, which will cover much of their bodies. So we'll say at least shoulders to knees, right? Nudity, partial nudity, partial and even full nudity, is an occasional aspect of religious rites, as it is such an unusual state. We'll say people even bathe in their underclothes, which might even be an even further layer. We would say clothes, or in rags, something like those lines. So you're not going to wear necessarily your good clothes to bathe in, but you're going to wear just some sort of general cast-off stuff to bathe in. You're not going to just strip down. I like that. That makes things a little different. So people are wearing a lot of leather, covering a lot of their bodies, and so as a result, I think there's going to be a lot of personalization. And I think we mentioned up here somewhere that families are very close. Communal property is a norm, except anything one other person except clothing. Oh, so clothing is often communal. It's generally communal. All right, so that's interesting. So often, your outfit is something that the ranch owns, basically, and it's sort of in a communal pile. People are grabbing it and going back and forth. So that's going to imply a couple of things. It'll imply that needs to be washed fairly frequently. Also, that there'll be a differentiation between sort of like underclothes versus those things. So people will have the equivalent of underwear that they wear next to their skin. Maybe not the entire thing they wear next to their skin, but there'll be something that they have as kind of padding that is their personal clothing. So let's be more specific about that. Clothing is a special case. Outer layers, particularly leather, are communally owned, but people generally, but every person owns at least a few pairs of underwear. Let's put those in quotes so we know it's not our sense of underwear. Underwear. Anything within a person's bedroom is owned by that person. And let's be more clear, any objects housed within a person's bedroom is owned by the person, right? So we'll be very clear about that if there's some physical thing that you're carrying around and you keep it in your room, that is yours. Certain branches have property rights to certain dyes or colors or patterns and decorations. That could be. Because you have communal clothing, that would make sense. So we'll say each ranch has its own variant of clothing, particular colors, patterns, and particular colors and patterns worked into cloth or leather. Yeah, so some ranch might have a particular, like a rose stitched into every leather apron, every leather shirt, and every boot would have this particular design worked into each and every one. Or some of them might have this particular, blue that they stain much of their clothing in. I like that a lot. Good idea, Seth. Let's see here. Leather. This is one way that each ranch differentiates itself. Yeah, so that works back into that idea of clothing as an identifier differentiator. We'll say there are big variations in clothing between different trades and different levels of wealth. You are expected to dress a certain way if you are a middle class entertainer or a wealthy smith, right? That makes sense. So clothes make the man, and if you're not wearing what you're supposed to be wearing, people will be very suspicious of you and very, very, very confused. And it won't be a completely, it's not a full uniform you're expected to wear, but there will be some very specific characteristics of each kind of trade and such. And similarly, I think, children's clothing will be somewhat distinctive, where they're not going to be, a child's set of clothing will not be necessarily worked the same way as adults' clothing will. Similar, but children will be expected to wear things maybe more simple than adults do, to indicate that they're not fully formed yet. So I like that. Let's go back to our principles. Clothing is status. We already said status in terms of more and more leather. We have an idea of how much people take their clothes off. Do you want tattoos, piercing, head shaping, other forms of bodily modification? This might be an interesting thing for our dude ranch world. The problem with piercings on a ranch is that it's too easy for something to catch a piercing and rip part of your ear off, or nose, or other part of your anatomy. So I can see it being, then that doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to happen, but it's an interesting sort of safety hazard, if you will, which society may or may not care about. This might actually be a good thing for things. Some trades differentiate through body modification. We'll say storytellers are often tattooed. singers are often pierced. Smiths almost always shave their heads. Just why not? We'll have those in there. Well, in fact, no. Have tattoos. Fingers are pierced. We'll think about where they might be pierced later. If you're singing, you're probably not going to pierce like your mouth or your tongue. You can certainly pierce ears, nose, any other part of your body. Again, since people are pretty heavily clothed, you're not going to pierce things people aren't going to see. I mean, you might, but it's not going to be relevant to society necessarily. So pierce navel, okay, who cares? And anything beyond that gets kind of weird. I mean, why would you pierce your fingers? It just gets in the way, unless that's a significant thing. I have to think about that a little bit. I'm not sure how else you do that, but that might be an interesting thing. Where I've always kind of liked the linked piercing nose to ear. That'd be an interesting thing for singers to have a piercing that way. Let's just add that in. Singers wear a chain hanging between an ear piercing and a nose piercing. Senior singers have chains on both sides of their faces. Might even be, left side means you're level 1, right side is level 2, and then once you're a master singer, you have them on both sides. Okay. Smiths always shave their heads. Again, this is a differentiation. Okay. That's cool. I like that. All right. I think that will do it for clothing. That gives us a good idea of the difference in clothing. Let me grab my list of attributes here. See what we've covered. So we covered that. We haven't covered justice yet. That might be a good next thing. We haven't covered money either. Nor have we covered wealth. What does wealthy look like? How wealthy can you be? How can you acquire wealth? How does wealth get redistributed, etc. Entertainment, literacy, social axes, past empires. So I think justice might be our next topic. Sack we'll also have to cover at some point. We've already covered it to some extent, but just, what are the taboos around that, and what's acceptable, and it could go all the way to the biology of it, like how does that work, and things like how effective is birth control, all that stuff. That might be our next topic, because it's a very important thing to a lot of societies. So we have money, we have sex, there's basically money or sex, isn't it always? So I think we go either way. I think we're going to have to cover sex next time. So sex, love, and everything in between. How are babies made? How is that handled in society? Who can you have sex with? That kind of stuff. Compare Romans versus Greeks versus modern America versus modern Europe versus modern, other places in the world. Lots of different views around that. So we'll do it. We won't get too crazy about that. I think that should be that'll be an interesting topic. So that'll be for next week. We will talk about that. And for now, that is clothing. And I think that helps. And also the clothing helps us get a little bit more of a sense of, when you're seeing somebody that you really like in a state of undress. That tends to be rather exciting. So cool. That helps us quite a bit, and I think that will do it for us for this week. Those watching live, stick around, please. Another 10 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes. I'll be starting Workshop Wednesday, and that will be coming up here momentarily on the live streams. We'll be going dark for a few minutes and coming back with that. Actually be shutting down the stream and coming back in 10, 15 minutes. But anyway, thank you all, and we'll see you next week.